Thank you all for coming tonight. This is the third Justice Forum for the semester, and those of you who are Justice Forum veterans, you know that it's usually on the first Wednesday of the month, but the first Wednesday of November might be a very scary day. So we decided to move it along and make sure that we'll have this event rather than be somewhere else and maybe crying. No, you don't think so? Because I'm Greek. So it's before I introduce Professor Vialette, I just want to thank again the Casa Hispanica for the wonderful hospitality, and Eunice Rodriguez, who is in the other room discussing Puerto Rico in the context of this election. And also the people at the Heyman Center, Eileen Giluli, everyone who helps out there, and obviously Sylvia Gitnick, who takes care of all the tech for the for Justice Forum. And of course, we have a very long list of co-sponsors. You can look them up on our website. So without further ado, I want to welcome dear friend, Professor Aurélie Vialette, who, as of this year, teaches at Yale University at the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. She specializes in 19th century literature and Iberian cultural studies. She focuses most recently, right, on Filipino and Catalan contexts, and engages with carcerality, disability, transatlantic studies, slavery networks, archives, popular music, journalist discourses, public discourses, mass and working class organizations. And she's preparing a book that is tentatively titled The Trial Run, Gender, Disability, and Penal Colonies in the 19th Century Philippines. But I also want to mention the fact that she's also working, and it might materialize, on a project on prison writing. Okay, so thank you so much, Aurélie, for coming here. And Aurélie, as usual, she will give her talk, and then we will have a short discussion, and then we will open it up. It's yours.
Thank you, Neni. Thank you for this amazing invitation. I'm very, very happy to be here today, especially at Casa Hispanica. I haven't been here in years, and it used to be a sort of intellectual home for me. I actually taught a class in this room as an adjunct right when I finished my dissertation. So, you know, it's very, very nice to be here, and I thank you, Neni, for inviting me to this forum and for being here. Today, I'm going to give you an overview of the book I'm working on, and the title is The Trial Run. I hope I will explain why in a moment. This book explores the use, and I have about 30 minutes. So the book explores the use and abuse of Filipino prisoners in agricultural penal colonies in the late Spanish Empire. I've put a map here so that you can see convicts transportation at that time, and especially where the Philippines are, because I'm working on the southern Philippines. I examined the administrative archive of the penal colony, where it is explained that the Spanish government had conducted a preliminary trial, what I call a trial run, of a method of incarceration and cultivation of the land. This method entailed the forcible displacement of Filipinos from the northern part of the Philippines, which is in Manila, the island of Luzon, so you can see that on the map, to the southern regions of the archipelago, with the ultimate destination being the island of Mindanao. and you see that as well in the map, with Zamboanga being the city that the prisoners were taken to. The objective was to demonstrate the viability of penal colonies and their potential replication on other islands. So the Philippines has more than 7,000 islands. So the Spaniards wanted to replicate this model. Spanish documents refer to this as an ensayo, a trial, and there is an emphasis on the idea of trial and error. If we make an error, then we're going to try again. This aspect illuminates how Filipinos were exploited as dehumanized subjects of experimentation. And the experiment encompassed issues related to prison labor, with prisoners performing both agricultural and construction work, economic profit, sexual reproduction, and the treatment of prisoners, all framed through a rhetoric of able-bodiedness. As Adra Imada has explained, able-bodied individuals occupy a central position in the politics of colonialism. And this is of particular significance when considering penal colonies. The southern island of Mindanao, the focus of this study, was regarded as the most perilous location and served as the destination for individuals whom the records call murderers, bigamists, and sodomites. And those are the words used in the files of the prisoners in their sentence. So in many ways, this archive requires a multifaceted approach, incorporating perspectives from gender, race, queer, and disability studies. It should be noted, however, that a reasonable number of the sentences recorded in the prisoners' files are difficult to comprehend. It is evident that the judges would occasionally impose the same sentence for a murder as for a theft. And here, I mean, you can probably not read it, but you have the file with the names of the prisoners, the crimes they've committed, and the sentence. And you can see in one of, and all the documents that they were all sentenced to the same number of years. So the rationale behind this decision was the necessity for labor and the desire to colonize a land that was perceived as inadequately subjected to Spanish authority. In order to be sent to a penal colony, an individual would have to serve a 10-year sentence. That was the minimum. As a result, the majority of prisoners were sentenced to a 10-year imprisonment. This automated replication of a sentence within the archive of the penal colony represents one of the numerous technologies of state power. In line with Anstaller's approach, I view administrative documents as valuable sources for understanding the epistemic practices of their creators. Indeed, archives are not just a record of what happened. They also show a precise crafting and gives us information about the world surrounding the individuals who shaped them. The Penal Colony Archive, you will see, is made of artifacts that have been combined in a structure that can only be fully understood if one pays close attention to the specifics of the colonial ideology and capitalism that underpin its creation. I propose to call this a sort of poetics of the colonial archive because of all the artifacts that are used within it. It is, however, important to consider the emotional context of those Spanish administrators in the Philippines. The disintegration of the Spanish Empire in America hangs above the heads of administrators, so to speak. It is a cautionary tale for them, serving as a reminder of past failures that should be avoided in the future in the archipelago. This awareness shaped the very existence of the archive, which was created in response to the anxiety that pervaded the administrative mindset. As Harold Fisher Time has indicated, and I quote, "The history of empires has been shaped to a considerable extent by negative emotions such as anxiety, fear, and embarrassment, as well as by the regular occurrence of panics." End of quote. This is precisely the line of inquiry I intend to pursue. Indeed, what I refer to as administrative anxiety in my book plays a key role in elucidating the intricate dynamics of penal colonization in the Philippines. And I consider myself fortunate today to be among you, and I'm hopeful that you can help me find a more effective way maybe to explain this issue. It's a work in progress, as I was told this forum was about. So I would like to know how to define or work better the concepts I use to study this archive. In the book, I put forth the argument that this poetics of anxiety can serve as a theoretical framework for understanding political decisions made at the end of the Spanish Empire. Focusing on the Philippines, I demonstrate that urgency and fear shaped the strategies employed in the administration of colonial rule in the penal colony. In Mindanao, and I will explain with some examples, this archive encompassed correspondence, agricultural reports, medical reports of imprisoned Filipinos, maps, and activity reports. I show how administrative praxis is driven by an underlying anxiety about its own viability. Administrators expressed concerns about the penal colony's ability to meet imperial expectations on a consistent basis. It's all over the archive. So I listen to the voices of the administrators and attend to the specific words they use within the conventions of administrative writing. Fear, pain, distress, and empathy, among other emotions, have been analyzed as violent sentiments that drive the colonial impulse. Anxiety, as the result of this urgency to maintain the Spanish Empire in Asia, has yet to be fully examined, particularly in terms of its role in articulating the administrative impulse to subjugate both imprisoned individuals and the land. And I will explain why, through meticulous planning and decision-making. This might help us problematize the production of knowledge and power structures within the carceral archipelago at this pivotal moment in Spanish history. Anne Stoller has explained the anxiety she finds in the voices of Southeast Asian administrators as they endeavor to elucidate the tenets of colonial governance, the manner in which they discuss colonized bodies, and their predictions regarding the outcomes of such discussion by examining the past. In the case of the 19th century Philippines, the past serves as both a point of reference and a means of establishing a colonial sense. It also provided a justification for the late conquest of this vast territory that you saw on the map, where Spaniards lacked control, employing vocabulary that had been used by conquistadors for centuries. So they used the same vocabulary over and over again. This justification facilitated the legitimization of European domination in Asia, where colonialism was practiced in a novel manner, with punishment paving the way for future occupation of the land by Spaniards sent from Spain. So that was the ultimate goal of the project, but it never really happened in the south of the Philippines. I believe we must examine anxiety as a manifestation of capitalism within the context of the penal colony. It is evident that understanding of the role of racial capitalism in a project of this nature is essential. Indeed, the racialized exploitation and accumulation of capital serve to reinforce the carceral project. And I will address below how the extraction of resources is also part of it. The Penal Colony Administrative Archive is a site of capitalist knowledge. The quest for knowledge is perceptible in each document and in the voices of colonial administrators who craft budgets with different scenarios with 80 men, 100 men, 200 men, 300 men. So that's one of those documents. They build statistics and attempt to manage planting and crops with their foreign perception of the weather and land conditions. Plans are fully fleshed out from economic costs to benefits, which is explained in this document, where you have, on the one hand, ingresos, which is what, comes in, gastos, what comes out, and then the balances and the note in the notas, you have this is for 100 men, and we can change it accordingly, depending on the number of prisoners we have. So from economic costs to benefits, from the land distribution to potential challenges associated with the incarcerated population. Next one, thank you. The templates, which feature some missing data, and those are the two documents as an example, also exemplify capitalist predictions. The Penal Colony Archive contains a surplus production of documents, including multiple projections designed for the same project. So this provides insight into the nature of the capitalist enterprise envisioned for the penal colonization process, which sought to instrumentalize everything and everyone. These documents illustrate a methodology for the organization and archiving of data. The replication of documents is a fundamental aspect of this process. However, the presence of blank documents in the archive indicates as well that the project was interrupted midway through its implementation. The data that was never produced should have been incorporated into many of these files. The documents also illustrate this quest for knowledge I was talking about, predicated on a Eurocentric understanding of what constitutes expertise. It serves as a means to remedy colonial anxieties, although it never disappears completely. Data sets are combined in the archive to reform imprisoned people, extract wealth from the land, and produce what Spaniards called colonial villages. And we can talk more about that because the colonial village was supposed to be the extension of the penal colony with the same imprisoned people that were then sent to the colonial village. And although they were freed, they were still under the control of the Spanish colonials. So the composition of social groups in the colonial village was closely managed with specific criteria for each group. Women were dedicated to the occupation of their sex. So that's the formulation that occurs in the archive, very common. Men were required to be physically able to work on the land, and the land itself was prepared to be a site of extractivism. This plan produced statistical data sets for both individuals and the earth, which could be studied, modified, and applied in the future. So all these data sets were studied, and there were reports written and sent to Manila from Mindanao, and then to Spain from Manila. Statistics play a pivotal role in the Penal Colony archive. They support the state's intervention on the bodies it incarcerated and the land it conquered. The intervention of the prisoners' bodies represents a further key factor driving the Penal Colony's impulse. The necessity for robust and normative bodies capable of labor and sexual reproduction is a crucial element of the project's viability. Nevertheless, an analysis of the medical records in the administrative archive reveals the nature of colonial medicine applied to these bodies as a means of advancing colonial capitalism through prison labor. The medical terminology utilized by these doctors in the tables they're created, and there is one on the screen as an example, serves to define a particular type of disability within the colony, thereby establishing the disabled body as a deviation from the colonial project. You can see that bodies are labeled as useless for the colony, with a designation that calls for their rejection, removal, and disposal, as evidenced by the documents. Prisoners are armless, they limp, etc. So there's a lot of vocabulary that can be analyzed. So a column here labeled cause of uselessness, and the title showing how these imprisoned persons have been cambiados por otros, which means exchanged for others. And this is in the very long title of the document on top of it, further accentuate their rejection. The concept of change and exchange, when considered alongside the issue of capitalist production and reproduction within the penal colony, reveals much about how government officials perceived the imprisoned indigenous population as disposable bodies. The nomenclature in question demonstrates a pervasive and systemic rejection of bodies that could not be incorporated into the logic of productivity. The logic of capitalist productivity here implied that the bodies of those imprisoned in the carceral archipelago were to be treated as a means of production. In a colonial context in general, colonizers need to perform their colonizing functions at the level that the colonial power demands. So their ableness is central to the colonial project. The colonized, in turn, are always consistently regarded as disabled, either cognitively, reproductively, or physically. They are seen in historical documents as vulnerable to contagion or infection. In the 19th century, the construction of the cognitive disability of the colonized Filipinos was further reinforced by the notion of their so-called quote-unquote primitiveness. Indeed, Christopher Schmidt-Navarra has demonstrated the significance of the Spanish gaze towards the colonial other in comprehending the racialized construction of the Filipinos, who were relegated, and I quote, to the most primitive state of social evolution. One particular illustrative example to explain that is the display of living individuals transported to Madrid from the Philippines for the 1888 General Exhibit of the Philippine Islands. Schmidt-Navarra posits that the event presented, and I quote, a staging of the primitive and the dramatization of people from the archipelago in native attire, in dwellings and habitats reproduced for the event, exhibited like caged animals, end of quote. To return to the photo presented here to the document, we may cite Sonny Koraniev-Bolton's concept of creep colony, which posits that the colonized body is predisposed to impairment through the colonized gaze. The colony implies a logic of rehabilitation, which is also evident in the discourse surrounding incarceration and perceptions of capacity. Finally, in the book, I also examine agricultural reports to demonstrate how the earth, including land and insects, is a source of anxiety for administrators that necessitates for a distinct colonial intervention in accordance with incarceration methods and the advancement of colonial capitalism. The concept of biopolitical ecology intersects here with the biopolitics of empire in the penal colony. So there is an intervention and control of political power on the biological lives of individuals, which is how I understand biopolitics from very closely Michel Foucault. Furthermore, the term trial, ensayo, that I was talking about at the beginning of this talk, and its various potential iterations is employed by officials when discussing strategies for enabling the land to accommodate human exploitation for agricultural reproduction. The objective of the Spanish colonists was to extract as much as possible from the land, to establish a self-sustaining agricultural structure, and to expand their presence. This was done without consideration for the social structures that had previously existed on the island. Indeed, colonial extractivism results in the erasure of native populations from historical records, as Gomez Barris understands it. So this phenomenon is exemplified by the Penal Colony Archive, which fails to reflect the social complexities of the communities that are completely absent from the archive. The term Indian, was used to refer to the native indigenous people across the archipelago, independently of the ethnic and linguistic diversity of those groups. I explore some of the resistance to the trial run in this penal colony called San Ramón, demonstrating that from the outset of the penal colony's existence, both land and insects rebel against extractivism, occupation, and exploitation, thereby endangering the entire colonial project. There is a compelling argument to be made for the intent of resistance to incarceration and labor methods by the natural environment. The land itself presents a multitude of obstacles to colonial occupation. Logically, the inhabitants of the Philippines engaged in agricultural activities, reared livestock, fished, and traded with other countries. But yet the Spanish colonizers introduced their new agricultural techniques, including planting and harvesting methods, disregarding this local knowledge and the practices. So this had consequences. Letters from Spanish officials attest to the difficulties they encountered in dealing with the land, showing that agricultural methods failed to yield the desired results, and they complained a lot. The archive demonstrates this frustration and of the officials attempting to extract from the land. And this enables us to perceive the narrative of colonial occupation regarding the natural world. Serenella Novino has demonstrated the significance of examining nature's voices, which encompasses animals and landscapes and other elements. The Spanish officials in their letters and reports frequently note that the land has the capacity to grow at a faster rate than what can be achieved through human intervention. Furthermore, documents attest to the fact that the presence of insects, and in particular the locusts, and I have a funny story about my encounter with the locusts. So the presence of locusts in the air and the soil constitutes a significant hindrance to the completion of Spanish called agricultural projects in the penal colony. The term invasion, both as a noun as a verb, was employed to describe the presence of insects on the agricultural land. And however, this terminology becomes ironic when viewed through the lens of the colonial archive, as the invaders were undoubtedly the Spaniards, not what existed prior to colonial occupation. So there's a lot of documents that I try to analyze through this lens in the book, because the vocabulary just like is evident. So I entered this archive questioning why historical official accounts have deemed the penal colonization of the Philippines a failed project in comparison to other penal colonies. It is challenging to define success in this context. What constitutes success? Furthermore, is the concept of success even applicable when examining historical events? If we assume that success is defined by the complete colonization of the Philippines by the Spaniards through incarceration, our analysis of the sources will be influenced by this ideological perspective. Nevertheless, as I try to show in my project with an analysis of both local and metropolitan archives, Spain did indeed establish penal colonies with Filipino prisoners. This act of creation had a lasting impact on the land and its inhabitants. The site offers a unique opportunity to gain insight into the desperate impulses of Spanish colonial power in the late 19th century. Upon entering the archive, I was astonished by the sheer number of documents available for examination. Bundle after bundle, I perused the historical record, the crafting of the penal colony, and I discovered inconsistency between the Spanish officials' initial enthusiasm for the project, as expressed in their numerous projections, all these calculations that they projected for the future, and their subsequent analysis of the geographic reality. It became evident that these officials were experiencing a sense of anxiety regarding the realization of a project that was nearly impossible to accomplish. This anxiety and its consequences on the Filipino imprisoned body and the land is the subject of my study. It is also possible to argue that another form of success was achieved. I mean, historians that have written on some penal colonies, they always talk about success, like in Botany Bay, and it's success. I wonder, to me, there's a success in inflicting cruel punishment, that denying all forms of indigenous knowledge, agency, and sovereignty that resulted in constructions of this vast archipelago of prisons designed to control and subjugate the original inhabitants of the islands. Colonial administrative documents contain a wealth of invaluable data, yes. And yes, this data provides significant insight into the Spanish Empire and its multifaceted endeavors in the Philippines. But what is more, these documents were created by people and about people. Their names are all over the archive. Imprisoned people, administrative writers, or recipients of letters or reports. It is these individuals whose voices and names we want to pay attention to, as well as the language they use. Letters are stamped with the sender's marks and the names of recipients. A discernible pattern of communication emerges, comprising queries and responses, counsel, and grievances. These are voices that were once part of bodies that powerfully incarcerated Filipinos, serving the interest of the colonial power. Yet not all the voices are audible within this archive. Some were not part of the colonial administration, imprisoned people, Muslims, and Chinese, and you can talk more about Muslim and the Chinese if you're interested about that. Filipinos imprisoned during this period did not have the opportunity to write their testimony. They were sometimes called upon to appear before the judge and deliver an oral declaration. These declarations were then written up as reports, which were often translating from Tagalog to Spanish. In these instances, the translator's name and signature are present, and the Tagalog has not been transcribed, as it likely represents a simultaneous transcription of this translation. It is necessary to consider numerous filters, including the labor performed by the translator in the courtroom, and the voices of those who declare that are sort of being lost, even if we have the transcription. In order to reconstruct a narrative of the penal colony, it is essential to consider what is not in the archive as one of the technologies through which colonial power established its presence. In instances where administrative practice established paper trails on a regular basis, and there are so many documents, the notable absence of information regarding prisoners who formed the primary essential group of the good functioning of the penal colony is not inconsequential. I tried to show in my book a crucial aspect of the technologies employed in the penal colony, the uniformed treatment and discourse surrounding prisoners, which reduce them to a single analysis of their capabilities or disabilities. The second part of my talk today refers to the legacies of penal colonies in Zamboanga. It is a challenging task to examine this subject matter, and it is not really a component of my book, but maybe the conclusion, I don't know. So the penal colony in Zamboanga was destroyed during the Spanish-American War of 1898. What I have not been able to consult photographic records of the penal colony from the 19th century doesn't mean that they don't exist, but I haven't accessed them. And they're not at the National Archives of the Philippines. There are photographs of the prison constructed by the Americans in 1907 and documentation of other penal colonies built on a similar model, including the one in Davao. So the penal colony actually worked as a model because it was replicated in many islands. So the legacy of that trial indeed exists and impulsed the production of those other penal colonies. The Americans employed, so here you have photos that are from the 60s and the 50s of the penal colony and then the land. The Americans employed the techniques of government utilized by the Spanish Empire to establish their own imperial domination and have a self-sustaining colony through the cultivation of coconut, papaya, corn, and rice. Additionally, they sought to address the overcrowded panopticon prison in Manila, constructed by the Spanish in the 19th century and known as the Bilibid prison, which still exists today. It's in the center of the city. So the Spanish experiment in Mindanao offers an instructive case study. The past exemplifies the contemporary manifestations of imprisonment and subjugation. It is therefore relevant to adopt a transnational and transhistorical approach to understanding some part of the contemporary treatment of prisoners in our societies, especially why prisoners are said to undergo a civil death when they are in prison, which was all that was about in the penal colony. Mass incarceration and its capitalistic tenets are pervasive and can be traced back to the 19th century. We can illuminate our present and offer ways to fight structures of oppression by examining the language used to justify social, gender, and racial divisions. A comprehensive analysis of a case study, such as the trial run in the penal colonies in the Philippines, enables the understanding of policy debates and the functioning of colonial societies. Moreover, the detailed scrutiny of government archival records necessitates a critical evaluation of the language employed to justify the exploitation and mistreatment of prisoners in the establishment of projects such as this one, as a form of renewal of colonial practice. Penal colonies established institutional mechanisms that perpetuated hierarchical structures, thereby providing insights into the construction of colonial subjects, the use of prisoners in colonial context, and the exploitation of a rhetoric of able-bodiedness for racial domination. Thank you.
Oh. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
This was wonderful, Aurélie. Thank you so much for letting us into this new project. And I'm sure that everyone has a lot of questions. I have also a lot of questions. This is a very interesting project. I would like actually to start with a very pragmatological question. You just skirted a little bit. What was the panopticon prison in Bilibid? Was it an actual panoptical?
It is an actual panopticon. It was and it is. It was constructed with the central tower and all the architectural design of the panopticon. It's similar to the panopticons prisons that were constructed everywhere.
Bentham.
Yes, it's a Bentham model.
Okay.
And it still exists today. However, I think they have only, I saw it. I mean, friends took me there. Now it's in the middle of the city and there's actually like the subway that goes really near. So that's where we saw it. And actually the police was not happy when we visited, when we were there. So, but because at the subway station, we paid for the subway, but didn't take the subway, and they saw us taking pictures of the prison, and you can actually really see the people who are in the prison from the subway. So
because
they
it's still
no, we're here on a research project. So they were okay with that, but they were surprised that we're taking pictures of, obviously. But
still active.
It's still active, and one of the questions, about the reestablishment of the penal colony in Mindanao was to be able to send prisoners elsewhere. So that's, a technology used to displace prisoners' bodies to other spaces. Actually, the Panopticon prison used to be at the outskirts of the cities. In Barcelona, the Modelo was at the outskirts of the city. At the Beinecke in Yale, there's a photo of Manila, and you can clearly see it's a 1900, from the 1900, you can clearly see the Panopticon prison outside of the city, and now it's in the city center. So when it's outside, it's okay, but when it becomes part of the city, we want to send the prisoners away.
Yeah, of course, nobody wants a prison.
No, and that's what happened in Barcelona, because the prison was closed in 2017 because the association of the neighborhood didn't want to have a prison. There.
Yeah, and when was it built? The Bilibid?
The Bilibid, it is, I think it's 68. It was 78. I'm unsure about the date.
No, but 1970?
No, 18.
1878.
No.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So it's. I mean, as far as the Panopticon goes, it's a later prison. As far as prisons go, it's a later prison. As far as the Panopticon goes, it's an early Panopticon prison, right? Because
I'm unsure about the date also.
No, but it's not. It's
the second half of the 19th century.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm thinking is what Foucault tells us that about the Benthamite Panopticon, that it was never built, right? He says at some point
the thing is that the project that Bentham devised was never implemented as such, because when you look at the Panopticon prisons in Europe, what happens is that they never used the prison the way Bentham devised it, because Bentham clearly said that one prisoner per cell, a prisoner should be able to hear and do specific things in the cell. And you have different models, the Philadelphia, the Auburn, the prisoners would work together or work alone independently of those models. The idea is that the prisoner would be able to reflect by being alone, and that would reform the person. But then another crucial aspect is that whoever was inside the cell would never know if they were being watched by the person in the central tower. So that not knowing if you were watched would help you have a correct conduct. And you get used to that by being years in the Panopticon, and then when you get out, you don't know if you are being watched anyway. So you still keep in that, correct conduct that you learned. However, in many Panopticon prisons, and again, the one in Barcelona is the one that I've studied the most. It was, constructed at the very end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th. It was overcrowded right away. So instead of having one prisoner per cell, you had like tens, Right? And so, and that's what, prompted Foucault to analyze the Panopticon as a really perverse model. That shows.
But the structures themselves existed. I mean, they were put together. So I am fascinated by this project and the way in which you actually bring together the not just the history of coloniality with the history of incarceration or confinement, but what interests me the most is the fact that, from what I understand, this is a very early project, right? This is a project that comes very early in the history of thinking about incarceration and confinement, as being part of a not a colonial project that would in fact produce something, right? Not just extract, right? But produce, right? It would engage in the production, as you say, the production of knowledges and production of information, and that I find really very interesting. I mean, we have those colonies agricoles, right? That appear in I want to say early 19th century, right? Where we have, they are basically prisons, open air prisons, where prisoners engage in agricultural work. But those are not necessarily connected to a colonial project, right? But you're saying here something that is very well thought out and specifically executed, which was not the same way that the French Republic, let's say, thought about the colonial.
So what's interesting what interested me in this project is both that it tries to imitate previous projects of penal colonization, but with a very specific aspect, right? I'm going to explain. So Britain colonized Australia, Botany Bay, penal colonization. The French went to the French Guyane, Guyane Française, with penal colonization. But what they did was send their own people because they wanted to clean their public space from vagrants, prostitutes, criminals, etc. Right? So you clean your public space and you colonize because your people, the people you don't want in your public space, are de facto superior anyway to other people in your colonies, right? So that's something that Spain wanted to do. And all the project of penal colonization mentions the fact that it will be beneficial for the peninsula to, propose that those who are, vagrants, etc., beggars, yes, it was a big issue to send them away. But the Philippines was very, very far, and no one wanted to go. And so before spending money, I mean, it's a very, concrete thing. It's going to cost a lot of money. We're not going to spend that money if we're not sure it's going to work. So let's try that with Filipinos. And so they say, okay, let's try with the criminals that we have in Manila. It's another space that we want to clean. So let's send them to the south. Like no one wants to go to the south, right? The south. The south is the south everywhere. So the south, let's send them there and see what happens. And we're going to try and see if we do this, and then maybe change. And so all the documents are really, you have the sensation that they're taking the numbers and the people and everything, and they try to just make different scenarios. And they use people in the Philippines, right? Which is very particular because it wasn't done by the French, it wasn't done by the Russian. I mean, you have the penal colonies everywhere, and I mean, and after the independence, Chile had its own penal colonies. I mean, it's not something new in itself, but the project of using Filipino prisoners in the southern part of the Philippines and doing that before sending your own prisoners, yes, it redefines the question of penal colonization.
But it's also it's a double coloniality, right? Yeah. It's a double coloniality, right? Within the Philippines also. Will you tell us about locusts?
Oh yes, so the locusts. So that's an anecdote, but so an anecdote that I tell my students sometimes, because I teach a lot of archival studies and how to deal with archives and documents. And I was at the National Archives of the Philippines, and there is no internet, and I didn't have my computer because you work on their computers, and so all of a sudden I look at these documents, and they're saying, nos invaden las langostas. we are invaded by the locusts, and tens and tens and tens of documents talking about the langostas and how to kill the langostas. And it's like, the langostas, I didn't know they were langostas. So I was thinking about
Lagustin.
what? Not about locusts.
Crawfish.
Yeah. And I was like, this is weird. This is strange. And I couldn't look at the internet. I couldn't. So I spent the entire day reading about the locusts and trying to understand and to make sense of those langostas and how they wanted to kill them with galvanized irons. And it's very cruel. I mean, they're really into like, and they spend all their force and they complain after because we haven't been able to plant or to do anything because we're dealing with the langostas and we can't work on the land because so it's very funny. And then I went back to the hotel and then I looked for it and I said, oh God, those are the locusts.
Okay, so this brings up, a question of the archive, right?
Yes.
I mean, how do we know that the historians use the archive one way, and then we know that the rest of us use the archive in many different other ways. So I've been thinking. I mean, I read this piece when you sent it, and I keep thinking, and we were together on talking about an archive last week, and I keep thinking, how helpful can the archive be in the work that we do? I mean, I know that Anne Stoller talks about those empty phrases,
yes,
right? But you work on literature. I work with live, living human beings. We have a different content and context for words, right, than historians do. So how, I mean, I lose myself in the archive. And then really easily. But I guess what I'm asking is, how do you exert some not control, but how do you check the archive? How do you produce a reliability?
It's a complicated question, but I would say that first you have to be aware and self-conscious of your intervention. I mean, your positionality within the archive. I mean, and the archive is not, to me, it's not a place where I would extract, the data. I mean, talking about extraction, that makes sense. But on the one hand, then on the other hand, yes, you can get lost in the archive, and you can be sometimes subject to a need of exhaustivity because there's so much. And in this case, I mean, really, it's amazing. So the need to read and read and read and see if there's something else, and see if, in case you make a mistake and maybe there's this document that would contradict everything that you've read until then, and so that's something you need to be aware of as well.
Yeah.
I would say that, to the discussions, I don't know if you were going that way about reading along the grain, against the grain. I think you need to be doing a little bit of both.
Yeah.
In the archive, but you need to listen to, and spend time. And what I do, I mean, I get lost. I really love it. I feel like a voyeur a little bit because I read this correspondence. It's not for me. Like, it wasn't addressed to me. So I love it. And I've worked with personal correspondence, which is even more fun because, I mean, in this case, it's all administrative writing. So there's conventions, and you were talking about empty phrases. What Anne Stoller says, you have to look for, some of the meaning in those formulas, because it's all about, formulas in administrative writing. So there's a sort of detective work that you do as well, which is great. But in personal correspondence, you do that as well, and you imagine the lives of the people and who they were and what they were doing. And it's to me, it's fascinating.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I have to, I mean, I have excised what in correspondence that has been entrusted to me by people who were who were imprisoned, I mean, political prisoners, and have said, you know, here, use it, publish it. I have extracted or excised actually personal phrases. I mean, phrases that were really very intimate, and I don't publish those, right? Even though I have a permission to publish them, I don't publish those because as we know, what happens in correspondence, especially correspondence that comes from political prisoners, it's never clean in the sense that it goes in and out of personal thoughts and political prisoners, you know, political thoughts and what happens with the party and what's happening, right? So what I guess what I'm thinking about is this slippage that exists in personal correspondence between information and knowledge, right? I mean, we get information, but then we can construct and we can constitute, right? A universe of knowledge that what we do with that then is a question of second order, right?
Yeah, I understand. Where you're going to where you're going, I think you're asking about how we take this data and this knowledge that is in the archive. I mean, how do we trust?
Yeah.
You know, in this case, we have a lot of administrative reports. I mean, you don't really know. I mean, they explain what they've done, but there are so many variables. And also some documents are lost. I mean, we don't have the entire, you know, if it, I don't think
from beginning to end.
So what I've seen is that some documents that are in different archives talk to each other because there's quite a few bundles at the Archivo Histórico in Madrid, which I consulted prior to those in Manila, and then they dialogue with each other because they complement each other, right? So that's something that is also interesting, but there are some missing parts. So we need to be aware of that and not take the information as is, right? We need, where there's a critical approach to it, and we need to ask questions, and sometimes we don't have any answer to those questions, and that's fine. That's fine to say we don't have the answers. And I guess that might be the difference with historians who need, you know, all the. I mean, I don't know, not all, but you know,
well, I think that their project is different.
Yeah. So I'm fine with not having answers to some of the questions.
But do we have the answer to the question of whether or how much we can actually trust the records that have been created, have been produced by the administrators?
Well, we can trust the way they talk about what they want to do, to study. Like when I was talking about this anxiety, what happens in the Penal Colonial Archive is that many of the Spanish officials in the Philippines, and particularly in Manila, write reports to Spain to say, this is amazing. We're going to get rich and we're going to reestablish the Spanish Empire, which is, you know, crumbling, basically. So they build statistics to say, in 10 years, this is going to be great. We're going to have a self-sustaining agricultural colony. We're going to produce. We're going to do commerce with China. We're going to send wealth to Spain. So we can trust that. We know it never happened, but we can analyze the way they talk about it, the way they present the project, because they want Spain to send money there to be able then to do something because they're far, they send a complaint about being far, about not having money. So they try to convince. So there's a rhetoric here that is interesting to me, and that's what we should analyze.
Yeah,
and I think we should trust the voice we find, and the enthusiasm that then we see is not met with.
Maybe they just want to get the money out of Spain. They really know that they're not going to succeed. They know that they are not being
But they did try,
supported
they
as
did
they want.
try, they
But
tried.
I'm just wondering how much you call it voice, and I know that Ann Stoller also does.
Yes.
But I want to ask you if you would move away from voice, because it's not a voice. They are words. It's not a living voice, right? Which can slip, which can go back and rephrase something, which can have a little hesitance. It's something that someone has decided to commit to paper.
Yeah, I don't know, because those, if you look at who appears in the archive, there's this prison director who started the penal colony in Zamboanga, who's called Blanco. And he's the one who started to try to convince that a penal colony should be established there. So this guy Blanco appears, and I was like, who is it? Who is he? Okay, so I see he was in the penal colony for a few years, and then he goes back to Spain, and then he's named at a higher post, and then he becomes governor at one point. So I mean, like the penal colony, and it's a person, and it's he goes through like his career starting there. So yeah, I consider, I mean, he was a person and a voice, and had really an impact on that specific part of the Spanish Empire. So what I don't find is the voice of prisoners. I mean, I've been asked, can you try to write a paper on the voices of prisoners and their resistance and argument? I would love, but I don't know what to, I mean, I can say a few things, but I have material.
Yeah, there's nothing that has been.
I'd like that.
Okay, so whoa, okay, all right. So Travis, I'm sorry, do you want to identify yourself?
Adrian.
Adrian, Travis, Adrian, Stathis, and Patrick. Okay. Pass the mics, of course. A powerful magnet.
It is powerful, yes.
Do you want to give to Travis?
Thank you very much for this. The poetics of anxiety seems really generative, and not to make a facile comparison, but I work for this administration, and it also seems gripped by anxiety right now with regard to Israel, which is impelled also by capitalism. And we hear a lot about the banality of evil, but the anxiety of it seems really interesting. But I wanted to ask if you could potentially speak to what was taking place materially in Spain at the time, especially with regard to the technology of slavery, which I assume was abolished.
The what?
The technology of slavery, which I assume was abolished at that time.
Yes.
Yeah, but not to make another facile comparison, but what Saidia Hartman references the extension of the whip, or slavery by another name, within liberalism. And if there's a genealogy of slavery that you kind of witness in this project.
I'm so glad you asked this question, because I had a part of it and I had to cut because it was too long. So, okay, so so the period I work on is the second half of the 19th century, and the penal colony was created in the 60s and the rest of the century. So slavery was officially abolished, but it was also, not really abolished. And the trade was abolished, but then in Cuba, slavery existed until 1883, right? So in that period, slavery, there were slaves in some of the Spanish colonies. On the one hand, you were talking about, continuation of slavery through other forms of slavery. So coerced labor is a form of slavery. And what I find to go back to the topic, to this archive, there are some inconsistency in this archive where prisoners are supposed to be paid, but then the money, they had a debt, so the money they were paid was used to pay the debt. So very common. But then there are some prisoners from Ilocos, and some mention in the documents that those prisoners are not to be paid. I really don't know why. Those prisoners are not paid. Some of the prisoners are not paid. I don't know why, it's not explained, but there are several mentions throughout the documents where, we have economic tables of what is paid, what is not paid, what is produced, etc. And notes, as you saw in one of the documents with a table, and there were notes at the end. So one of those notes is prisoners from Ilocos are not paid. Okay. So here is a question about the kind of labor and different hierarchies of, prison labor here. On the other hand, prisoners worked on tobacco plantations as well. And one of the most famous, well, the only one is, in the Philippines, the Compañía General de Tabacos de Filipinas, General Company of the Tobacco of the Philippines, right? That was created by Antonio López y López. Antonio López y López is one of the most important slave traders from Spain in Cuba. He made a fortune in Cuba, right? And when slavery was being abolished in Cuba, but before, in the 1880, he created the tobacco company through a bank in which the capital of many of the slave traders were put to create the company. So it was a way of, whitening money to be used to create a company that can be considered a legacy of slavery. I mean, and in this company, I've worked with the archivists in Barcelona. There are weird things happening. So some boats go from the Philippines to Cuba and back. And there is one of these former slave traders called Larrinaga, a Basque merchant involved in the slave trade, who ships goods. And we don't know, it's not in the archive, but it says that he's paid in gold. And so, at that time, Michael Zusk, for example, who is someone who has studied the slave trade, says that since slavery was abolished officially, then slave traders were very careful to put, a few enslaved people in the boats, and they wouldn't mark it down. So it was a kind of, so that's why slavery was abolished, but not 100% until the very end of the 19th century. And there are inconsistencies in the archives that can tell us that something that has to do with slavery or coerced labor can be there, but it's hard to explain and to be sure. And here the historical data doesn't really. I hope I answered your question. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Sorry if my voice is low. I'm recovering from I recovered recently from bronchitis. I'm going to say this, some of these questions are going to be a little inside baseball. So for context, I'm a professor of Philippine history at NYU. So I'm really looking forward to the book. But one of the things I actually want to talk about, and, this is a conversation building off of the conversation as well about a suspicion of the archive, right? I think there's a way that once you actually introduce the social history of Mindanao and the Philippines, like a lot of the argumentation actually sort of falls apart. I'll say a few things. Number one, it's important, especially in the 19th century context, to note how tenuous the colonial occupation or non-occupation of Mindanao was, right? Like, I think there's a way that when you're studying Mindanao through the carceral archipelago, the carceral overdetermines what's actually going on in Mindanao, right? Which is a place that, number one, is in the Sulu zone. Number two, was aspirationally a settler colony of the Philippines, but never was practically a settler colony of the Philippines until post-1946. Which leads me to my second point, which is it is thus important, I think, and I want to hear you talk about, settler colonialism, but also race, and settler colonialism, but also race. It's equally important, I think, to get the history of race in the Philippines right. One of the, I think, tenuous parts of the argument of this paper that I found, and this is, I think, something that Sonny Cordañez Bolton also makes part of the limits of this book also kind of reaches, right? Because the thing about Crip Colony is that it's specifically Manila intellectuals writing about the rest of the archipelago coming from a Manila context. But when you're working with Mindanao, the ways in which nativeness, including the Indio, are defined in Manila don't necessarily apply to Mindanao or the rest of the Philippines proper, right? You alluded to the Moros, you alluded to Lulumad, right? But one of the things I want to kind of push back on you for is, how do I say it? I'd like to hear a bit of a clarification around those racial politics and around the ways that informed the development of the penal colony. Because one of the reasons why it was tenuous, and for example, a granular analysis of the racial politics actually reveals why a granular analysis of the racial politics actually reveals why Ilocanos were not paid. Right? This is a long transhistorical process in which Ilocanos were, and I wrote an entire book about Ilocanos and Igorots, right? And so this is an entire process through which Ilocanos are sent to the south, they're sent to other parts of the archipelago. Number one, because they eventually become communists, right? But there's this long history of anarchist insurgency, right? So long story short, I think one of the things I was kind of expecting from the talk and I hope to get from the book is, where's the Philippines in it, really, right? Like on the Philippines, on the ground.
Of course, I mean,
Right.
in the book, there's an entire. I mean, since the history of of the different islands of the Philippines might not be well known. I mean, I spent a great deal of time explaining the role of Mindanao within the Spanish Empire and the fact that it's an island that has a geopolitical reality that is very different from the rest of the Philippines. I mean, that's why I mentioned at the end, the question of the Muslims and the Chinese in the archive, which is something that I didn't explain today. But for instance, talking about the Moros, right? You mentioned the Moros. That's something that Spaniards were really worried about and interested about because Mindanao is composed, is mountainous, and in the mountains there were sultanates. Regarding Zamboanga, it was the Sultanate of Sinut, with which the officials of the Penal Colonies had really interesting relationship, I would say, because they would collaborate very much with the Sultanate in order to have them help when prisoners were escaping. And you have many documents, and some of them are really beautiful because they're in Jawi, which is like the Alhamiado, but they use the Arabic script to write indigenous language. So they're very beautiful. And so this is something that, of course, I talk about. I mean, you cannot talk about the penal colony without explaining the history of the Philippines and without considering the tensions that there was between the government in Manila and those Spanish officials that were in the south. What was your first comment?
I think I was talking a little bit about settler colonialism, right? Like, I think one of the observations, I think, just to kind of expand on that, one of the observations I made, and this isn't necessarily like something of this talk, this is actually something that's reflective of folks, especially from Spanish and American history, imperial history, that engage with the Philippines, right? Mindanao, like most of the rest of the archipelago, is written about as if it is already Philippine. And likewise, people in Mindanao are often written about, and I've been guilty of this in previous work as well, have been written about as if they were already Filipino, when the Filipino is a 19th, early 20th century concept that's invented and galvanized through this American colonial period. And Mindanao doesn't really become, this is stuff from Jojo Abinales and the Heredas, et cetera, right? Mindanao doesn't really, if at all, become Philippine until post-46.
I understand.
Right? And so like, I think one of the things I'm trying to push the project on and the ideas on is let's maintain that tenuousness and contingency when we're talking about the social and material historical, even as we're talking about something as rigid as a prison. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I understand what you mean. And definitely I can look at a way to be more precise about this terminology and about the contextualization of Mindanao. But for sure, I mean, there's what I do in the book is I situate clearly how the colonization of the archipelago took place and why the Spaniards were so interested in that part of the archipelago, because they're not that interested in other islands. But Mindanao, because of its geopolitical questions, was of real interest because it opened to other parts of the world where that created opportunities in commerce, etc. And well, another thing that I deal with in the book is the question of piracy, the pirates. That is extremely important when you work on that southern part of the archipelago. So there are many aspects that I didn't mention, but thank you so much. Yes, I will. Sorry.
Thank you. It was really fascinating. I actually want to draw out into, in broader horizon. I'm wondering about two things as I was hearing you talk. The first one will actually touch on the first question. It seems to me, let me put it in as a question. What would be, beyond the formality of terms, what would be the relation between a penal colony and a plantation in the broader colonial horizon, not even in the specifics of the area? And the question is very important even to today. Prisons in the United States being built in plantations in the South and still being prisoners, still in essence working on a plantation, picking cotton. That point leads us to the other relation between extraction in relation to, in essence, global capital, even beyond Spanish wealth, and punition, which is the whatever, the horizon of a penal colony. The punitive includes obviously retribution, some sort of retribution and rehabilitation. Extraction certainly has none of that. So that broader question about the history of plantations and how that is linked to your point. And the second was fascinating also for me. I'm wondering, again, from not obviously from a position of not being a specialist in the least, is when we think of colonial administration, we always think of extraordinary cold rationality to the point of machine-like, practices. And anxiety in the colonial narratives, again, broadly speaking, is reserved specifically about the relations with colonized subjects, with the natives. They produce anxiety because, of course, relations of power and their difference, otherness, etc. So I was expecting, you started talking anxiety. I thought, well, that's incredibly interesting, anxiety on the part of administrators. And then you proceeded to show cold rationality to the extreme of even going into speculation, future project. And so I don't know what is the, comparatively speaking, because I really don't know, how this relation between administrative anxiety in the context of cold calculation. How is this phenomenon something that you know about more in the broader colonial setting?
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna try to. So the first question regarding the relation between penal colony, the penal colony and a plantation in this context. I've, you know, the goal, the way they explained, the colonial administrators, the way they explained the goal of the penal colony is that it had as a, it had to do with the question of reform of the colonial subject, of trying a method that could allow Spaniards to be sent there and to form the colonial villages. So that's why I said, you know, maybe we could talk more about the question of colonial villages, because the colonial village is a real important concept in this archive, and that I analyze a lot in the book, because the ultimate goal of the penal colony is to create those villages. And those villages, so the idea is that the prisoners who are Spaniards, right, in the project, because the penal colony, the trial run has been successful. So it is successful, so we send our own people and we have them in the penal colony. And after, there are different scenarios. If in the penal colony, because it's a mix, there are women, there are men, if they get married, that's actually a royal decree that mentions that. So if they get married, they get a reduced sentence for good behavior. And we give them a piece of land. That piece of land allows them to work, to have their house in the colonial village, and they have Spanish babies, right? And then they still pay something. It's like a diezmo, and like in English is the tithe, or yeah. And the project actually mentions that they will be subjected to control by the administrators of the penal colony, because those villages are on, you know, very close, and they will be subjected to control for 2 or 3 generations. And I was like, this is interesting that they mentioned 2 or 3 generations, because that's the actual conception of blood purity by the Spanish Inquisition, which was current at that time. So they really imagine a reform of prisoners through these, you know, religious ideals and idea of what constitutes, you know, the Spanish family, the reformed prisoner, who will have babies, who being born on the island, they say, and that's textual, being born on the island will be firmly, will, you know, they serán asentados, right? They would really be able to stay there and become subjects and be interested in forming the new nation. So that's the difference. Because it's coerced labor, yes, it's exploitation, yes, but the goal is to have the empire grow at a time when the American colonies were gaining their independence. So that's a different project. There were tobacco plantation, I mean, fields and etc. But so that, you know, that's a fine line, but it's different. That's the way we would explain it. And then, yeah, right. So I'm not really sure about this entire, the question of, about the term actually, but there's something that I perceive in this colonial administration, in these documents and in the letters and the reports, is and you're right, there is calculation. All the documents is kind of cold, as you say. I like how you said it. You said, you know, cold calculation in the projections, coldness and machine of reproduction, that's for sure. But it stems from a place where there is this necessity of going forward, but not knowing how. So that's why sometimes I see this production of documents and calculations as coming from a place. I mean, the words they use in their letters, they're desperate. So maybe that's not the way to say it, and that's why I wanted to try it out. I'm really unsure, and I said it at the beginning, but maybe I need to find another way, but that's really what you can perceive in the words that they use.
No, I like it.
Yeah.
It's not, it complicates things.
It's, yeah. But, mhm.
Okay, yeah, great. Hi, thank you for this presentation. I'm a PhD student. Thank you, thanks. I'm a PhD candidate at Princeton, and I appreciate seeing this research because I study the transformation of the carceral system in the Philippines under American and then Filipino rule. So it's interesting to see the kind of the origins more. I kind of had a two questions, one slightly building off of Adrian's comment. And I guess what I was slightly confused when you said that Filipinos were transported to, to Spain for the 1887 Expo, like Filipino.
No, to the south.
No, right. But there was the
Oh, the
1887.
1887.
Yeah,
Yes,
and
1887.
Yeah, and you use the term Filipinos, and I was confused because at that time that refers to like Spaniards born in the Philippines now. I mean, so I guess that was just a clarification.
Okay, so yes. Right.
But
Okay,
I
go
guess
ahead.
to go on, I was curious about the kind of differentiation between indigenous Muslims in the South and natives who were transported to the South, particularly in relation to like religion. And so I'd like to invite you to just talk more about Muslims, especially with Christianity, and not only with the Spanish, but also with like northern Tagalogs and Ilocano and others who were Christianized, supposedly, and then transported to the South. I'm wondering if like religion plays a role in the incarceration. Like for instance, was there a church in the Penal Colony? Like what happened there, and how did that relate to the Muslims that dominated the territory? Talking about settler colonialism. That's one question, and then I guess the second question is just a broader question about how you're engaging with other carceral studies, particularly like carceral geography and abolitionist thought that is really kind of building and exciting at this point. So
okay. So about the exhibit in Madrid, it's originally the exhibit was thought to show Madrid the commerce and culture and industry of the Philippines. But it ended up being what Luis Ángel Sánchez called an empire industrial case, un imperio en la vitrina, because it became a spectacle of the people that Spaniards brought from the Philippines to Madrid. And you're right, it was very different people. They tried to represent all the ethnic diversity of the Philippines at that time. So they transported people from different islands, among them the Muslim, Igorot, etc. I mean, they transported a lot of people, and then it became this spectacle for everyone to see. Oh, no, and they did not. I mean, it was if you look at the press, for example, and everything that was published at that time in order to, explain how the exhibit was being prepared, and everyone was very anxious, and to the point that, people couldn't wait, and they tried to get into the Retiro Park and look at the people, but this very voyeuristic approach to it. And in the press, you can see that they really explain who the people were from and use the different name. Again, I mean, I mentioned it in passing, but that's something that many scholars have studied, and it's a complex. It was tragic. I mean, a lot of them died, and it was. Regarding the religion, yes, it plays a role. The Penal Colony has a church, and of course the need to impose religion is something that you can find in the book. I mean, that's part of the project because the entire project is about colonization. So religion, and especially in the Philippines, I mean, religion and basically, you know, the Spaniards who were there, I mean, a lot of them were the religious orders. I mean, they are the ones who had a, you know, more impact than the colonial administration, I would say, in a sense. I mean, so yes, I don't know if you said, oh, and how do they relate with the Muslims? That was one of the questions. So that's something that colonial administrators mention, the hope to subject the Muslims to, but that they also say that's something we are never going to achieve. So in the documents, what you can see is that there's this tension, a sort of tension between what they want and what is possible. So what they, as I mentioned earlier, what they did was enter into a sort of collaboration so that they would accept the penal colony and then see if afterwards there was a possibility to really conquer the Sultanate. But that's the way they related to the Muslims in terms of religion. They didn't really do any specific effort to conquer the territories where basically the mountains. Your other question that has to do with a broader approach to carceral studies, I have worked on abolitionism in Spain and the question of abolitionist thought, especially because here that's something that people in carceral studies work a lot. So I was curious to see how abolitionism was being approached in Spain. And I have to say that it's a very minor movement. I have an essay coming out on that. I interviewed many people, activists, but also judges and lawyers in different cities of Spain, Barcelona, Madrid, Valladolid, Bilbao. There's a professor in Navarra who's a specialist of that, and she told me that basically when she went to conferences talking about prison abolition, people looked at her like she was someone from another planet. That's what she said, more or less, with these words. What Spain has implemented regarding abolitionism has to do with a sort of reparation program, or I don't know how, what you call it in English, but it's it's a consensus kind of program that help people. They did that a lot with terrorism, with ETA, right? Having people who had been victims of it or family members killed by ETA tried to have the terrorists write a letter. If the family accepted, they would enter into a communication, they would meet, and that would help, create a situation in which there was more acceptance and restorative, yeah, it's restorative justice. So now, with this model, they try to implement it with other pilot programs. And so there's a little bit being done in that, but it's very minor, and I think it's implemented in 2 cities. And what I found in the, while I was researching this, is that there's a lot of religious vocabulary and religious rhetoric behind the model of restorative justice in Spain. So it's a sort of conclusion that I had after looking into this. So that would be, my approach to that topic. That's what I've done.
Ivan, and so did you have a question? Okay. Ivan?
Yes. First off, this was absolutely fascinating. So my question is this: I understand that I guess the main purpose of the prison was to sort of extract the wealth and the lifeblood of the communities. Was there ever a time where the the script was sort of flipped.
The what?
The script was flipped, and the prisons themselves, the prison actually became the lifeblood of the communities. And the reason I say that is because we have towns here, like in New York, Dannemora, very poor town. Prior to the existence of a prison, it was very poor. They built a prison in the town over the protest of the community. 10 years later, now it's the biggest employer
Yeah.
of the town. If you take the prison out of that town, it dies.
Uh-huh.
It dies. So I'm just wondering if that has ever happened in the Philippines, where now the prisons are actually pouring lifeblood into the towns.
Yeah, I cannot answer that question. I'm so sorry. I don't have I don't have the knowledge to answer that question. But for sure, you know, prison labor and profit from prison labor is something that is certainly a subject nowadays. I mean, and it's, you know, as I showed with this, I mean, they profited from prison. They tried to profit from prison labor, and of course that's what we have today. So, but I don't know about.
But I think that what Ivan is asking is, would they still object to the presence of the prison after they find out that the prison is actually a major source of wealth and income for them? So why did, I mean, as you said earlier, the prison in Mindanao was originally built outside the city, and then it
No, I
became
said
part
about
of
the Panopticon in Manila.
I'm sorry, yes.
Yeah,
Panopticon in Manila. And then it became part of the city, right?
Yes, because with, you know,
because the
with,
city grew.
yeah,
Because
yes,
the
the
city grew.
19th century, that's what,
Yeah,
you know.
and right, and then military don't want to the prison in the middle of it, but the prison was still producing wealth for the city, right? I think.
I don't,
Ivan, is that
Yes.
sort of what you're asking?
If the prison went away today, would that be a problem for Manila or for the local areas, the surrounding areas, the immediate area?
I don't know. I can't really answer that question. But you know, the example I was giving about the Panopticon in Barcelona, the fact that prisoners went away had a real impact on the neighborhood, because, and it's a bit ironic, because people from that neighborhood, the Eixample in Barcelona, they complain about being in their balcony or their window and looking at the prison and seeing prisoners or seeing the wall of the prison. And so they organized, you know, a civic action and blah, blah, blah. Years after, the city of Barcelona decides to dismantle the prison, and prisoners are little by little sent to the outskirts of the city again, which complicates their lives, because their lawyers, their family members, how can they visit them if they're an hour from Barcelona when they were there, right there, they could visit them. So, but then, you know, they said, well, we want the prison to be a democratic space, horizontal, a space where we can all be together. So the city opens the walls. They create a sort of museum, because you had political prisoners during the dictatorship that were imprisoned there, so that the museum part, and then they created a garden, a daycare, etc. What happened? Well, real estate started to jump all of a sudden. So those people who didn't want to see the prisoners and who wanted the bodies of the prisoners to be sent away are now being sent away because they cannot pay their rent. So it's kind of ironic. It's a bit ironic. And when I researched that topic, I was like, oh my, you know, like, so it closed in 2017. The last prisoner was sent away in 2017. And since then, I can assure you, it's a really cool neighborhood. And the prison, you know, it has graffitis and it's all really, well, you know, a shared space, but it has consequences on the city when you know, when things like that happen. So that, you know, I don't know if that's the answer I could give you with an example I know of a change regarding the presence and absence of prisoners.
Denise and Sven, and then I think we're done. Before
Yeah, this is just going to be really quick.
Let me just say, after these questions and response and whatever, we have dinner downstairs, don't we?
Yes.
Let's take
Yeah,
Denise's,
I'm just
and then-
gonna add on because I think thank you so much. This was so interesting. It just kind of like opened my mind up to a whole new like epiphany type. So I think like to piggyback on Ivan, I think Ivan was kind of asking also like, is this almost like the same method, right? So they have different styles of how they imprison and punish and continue that capital circulation and, you know, going. They dress everything up, make it look pretty and say, well, this is a chance, this is a way out. But then it kind of like brings you right back, which is almost the same system that's happening here. So yes, I think it will be safe to say, yeah, I think without it, it can't survive, right? It wouldn't survive. So I just wanted to add on to that. And this is
Yeah,
great. Thank you.
Thank you, yes.
Next.
Yeah, let's hear the comment from,
good.
no, you can.
Yeah, do you want,
We
Do
got
you
to
want
squeeze it? Somebody wanted to go?
take my,
You wanted to go?
No, no.
Sylvia.
Oh,
That's okay. Yeah, but if it's,
Okay.
read the comments.
Honey A is responding to something that you said, but I'm not sure what. No, it doesn't really provide jobs. The prisoners enact as employees in Philippine prisons, and they make it seem like it's some kind of privilege. Some prisoners can actually go out of their cells to act as wardens or even run errands outside prison. Of course, this is unofficial.
this is about the Philippines.
Yeah, but then.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Honey. Mike?
No, first of all, I want to apologize. Okay, but I had a personal matter going in, but the good thing, I'm a British Jamaican, so I shared the boat and everything, because my great-great-great-grandfather.
Michael?
My great-great-grandfather was a pirate. And my other great-grandfather was a lord from England, so as much as it's crazy, and then the Jamaican prison there is crazy. But to bring it back up to here, I just came out the feds, and this is a money thing. This is a business. And like you said, it's oxymoron. Like he said, they go to the poorest community, but they give jobs to the people in the community, and that's the whole thing. Even Lewisburg, the community because you know when they do the per capita, the prison is counted involved. So even the towers before it's done, the community has to vote in it. So everything is a money thing to this day. I don't want to take long because I'm long-winded, and I was given 3 minutes.
Thank you.
All right, but I want to say it was real inspiring, and it just let me, because I have my history to the 1902, and I'm supposed to write an order, and now you motivated me now, and then with the writing class at the professors, I'm going to really push it forward.
Thank you, Mike.
Give him 3 minutes, I had to cut it.
Thank you. Do we have any more? Do you want to, no? Do you want to say something? Thank you. All right, so if we don't have any other questions or comments, I want to invite you all to come downstairs and have dinner with us. I want to thank Aurélie Vialette for